Hi guys, I'm Whitney and welcome back to my channel. I realize it's been a hot minute since we've had a chance to talk about what I've been reading and to do some just straight up book reviews. I wanted to go ahead and take the opportunity to get through some of this backlog that I have. So I'm not going to get through everything today, but I want you to know that I now have an Instagram channel. If you're interested in what I'm reading lately or staying more on top of it, you're always welcome to go check that out, although it is a little informal and I sometimes post my dog pictures or whatever. I would also encourage you that if you want to have some discussion, always leave me a comment in the comment section down below. But we have a Discord channel now. Yeah! So come check us out in the Discord. Come chat about what you've been reading. I'm always interested in checking those out. The first one that we have to talk about is one all the way back from one of my book hauls, and that is Robert Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So first of all, I absolutely love this cover. Second of all, this book was such a fun read. It was so easy to get through. This story follows Manny, who is an AI specialist who lives in a colony on the moon. And occasionally Manny gets called to go and fix the AI that is controlling sort of all of the supply and demand from the moon. All of the space travel, all of the logistics, if you will. And as we learn through Manny within the first couple of chapters, that the AI that Manny goes to work on is actually sentient and doesn't need fixed. They're just friends and they visit and hang out. Through this whole time, Manny and the AI end up getting more friends in their little friend group, and we end up seeing what life is like on the moon and how all of these corporations are pretty much sucking the colonists dry. They're charging them for water and then they charge them for waste removal, but then they just filter the waste and then recharge them for the water. And there's other big injustices in this novel as well. The AI, as well as this little like posh group that Manny has put together, have decided that they're going to manufacture a revolution so that way the moon can be independent from the corporations on Earth. And this novel was very interesting for this aspect alone. How to manufacture a revolution, especially when they're so dependent on Earth for resources, was a really interesting thing. All the little details that they set up for it, how they had to incite like unrest amongst the population and yet still try to maintain good relationship with Earth, was really fascinating. I really loved this book. Plus, it was a quick, fun, fast-paced novel. I really liked almost all of the characters. I do have to say that there were two particular things that really stood out to me in this novel. The first is that Heinlein chose to write this novel by not using certain articles. Whenever he could drop them and the sentence could still make sense, he did. And that gave this novel a really cool sort of future-y vibe, almost like, you know, the people on the moon have an accent.
Some logics get nervous breakdowns. Overloaded phone system behaves like frightened child. Mike did not have upsets. A quiet sense of humor instead. Low one. His idea of thigh slapper would be to dump you out of bed, or put each powder in pressure suit.
So I really liked that about this novel. It gave it this feel of being real a little bit more. This might not work for everybody, but it really worked for me. Another thing that we have to talk about is a little bit of Heinlein wish fulfillment here, because he definitely has polygamy on the moon, and he has, you know, the main character who definitely like sexualizes women a little bit. He tries not to, he's trying to be a good guy or whatever, but I really felt like there was some wish fulfillment here of like Heinlein being like, how could I sleep with more women than one and it be acceptable? There was a little bit of that in this book, okay? So if that's gonna be something that bothers you, you might want to skip it. But I will tell you that it's not a huge part of the novel. It has so many other really cool pieces that I would still recommend it. I still really like this novel. This one is one that I believe is not a satire. So in case you're of the opinion, and I think every Heinlein novel is a satire, here you go. I can't wait to pick up more Heinlein. I've really been enjoying going through all of his backlist novels. In the vein of literary science fiction, The Memory Police. Memory Police is a literary science fiction, and it takes place on an island, and it follows a character from her birth pretty much to her death, where she lives in this East Asian island community that are being patrolled and slowly forgetting things over time. Things as simple as what a calendar is or what a tree is. Whatever the thing is that is in their life that they're supposed to have forgotten, the entire community forgets it all at one time. It's implied that the powers that be or the authorities are doing this to kind of sort of control the people, and they're the ones who are choosing what is forgotten. The people, whatever is forgotten that first day, they're expected to burn or get rid of whatever item it is. And there are certain individuals within that community that have the ability or the immunity to remember rather than to forget. And the main character's mother is one of these people. She ends up getting taken by the memory police very early on, and then later her father is killed, and so she ends up alone for the majority of the book. And it's just about her struggling with knowing that this is happening and yet she can't do anything about it, trying to then have a little bit of rebellion back, and I'm not going to ruin the book to tell you what that is, and how she ends up at the end of the book. One of the things that you need to know about this novel to not be disappointed about it is, instead of going into it thinking that this is going to be very similar to like The Giver or something like that, don't expect this to be an overtly science fiction book. Think of it more as a literary book. It's definitely a big allegory for like dementia and Alzheimer's. I think that's safe to say because it never overtly says that. That's just my interpretation of this novel, and it's not going to really tell you anything about what happens within the story. However, I will tell you that the end was confusing for me until you understand that this seems to me to be a giant allegory for Alzheimer's, and then the ending made a lot more sense to me. But I really loved this book. It really talks a lot about who we are as people and how much our memories play a part of who we are. It was a very character-focused novel. There isn't a whole lot of action, but if that sounds like something that you're interested in and you just need that breath of fresh air that's not exactly like the other books you've been reading, Memory Police was really great. The next one is a fantasy novel, and this one is called Bear and the Nightingale. I know I'm really late on this book. Everyone on booktube seems to have already read this novel. This book was one that I was trying to read while I was doing all of my best of videos in December when it was cold. I really just needed something that was also cold. The Bear and the Nightingale is the first of a fantasy trilogy that is a Russian retelling of a fairy tale. And we have a main character, I'm gonna say Vasilia. She is living in this like edge of the woods log cabin with her family, who ends up having like a horrible stepmother who kind of sends her out into the forest to marry the entity that they view as Winter. This winter element almost always like kills the maidens that are sent out to him, but for some reason Vasilia is not. And we kind of follow her story along, going into his magical world, and there's a lot of snow and a lot of forest and a lot of fur, and it's such a cozy read. There is a lot of depth and darkness to this fairy tale retelling, but it's not one that is particularly familiar because I didn't grow up with any Russian fairy tales. I really enjoyed this novel. I thought it was fun. I thought it was something where I would pick up the second and the third one, but I'm not in a huge rush. It was sort of like one of those palate cleansing guilty pleasure reads that you just want to snuggle up in a blanket in front of a fire and read. That was this book. Next is I decided to pick up a couple of short stories. And I know I usually talk about novels, but I'm trying really hard to read a little bit more broadly, especially since science fiction in particular really started the genre with short stories. I decided to start with the man himself, Asimov, and I picked up a short story collection of his that you may have seen on my Instagram feed. This novel is a whole bunch of his short stories, and there are two short stories of his that everyone talks about. The first one is called Nightfall, which is what this book is named for, and a lot of people have said it's one of the best or greatest short stories of all time, which is quite a commentary if I do say so myself. The other short story is called The Last Question. I have read both of these, and I don't know that they're either of them the best short story of all time. I would probably strongly disagree with that, but they were really interesting reads. I will say that The Last Question is not in this pack of short stories, and I'm a little bit disappointed in that. And it's definitely one that sort of touches on some religion, if that's something that you're into. Otherwise, Nightfall was a really cool short story. It is available, I think, for free on the internet. It was a really interesting short story. I really liked it, but Asimov is probably not the guy to write it, if you know what I'm saying. It was very much a whole bunch of men sitting around a table discussing what's happening. I think that he knew that because the story was a cool idea. It's really all about our perception and our ability to understand. I think his friend Robert Silverberg actually, with his permission, wrote an entire novel based off of the short story, also called Nightfall. So that is a novel that I plan to read but haven't yet. Then I finally picked up the book called Our Lady of the Artilects. Our Lady of the Artilects is a self-published novel, although I didn't know that at the time. I picked it up because I found it on Goodreads somehow and read the back of the book. It sounded really interesting. This novel follows multiple points of view, and it takes place in sort of like this very overarching, broad political sense. We have a future world where androids are called Artilects, and all of the Artilects around the world all experienced a apparition. Sounds like a Virgin Mary, but nobody is really sure, and they all experienced it all at the same time. And as you can imagine, the Catholic Church, which is in the future now, is very suspicious of this. Everybody's like, what? That doesn't make sense. This is just like, you know, the best hacker of all time, right? And then we have a character who owns one of these Artilects that was specifically made for him, and the Artilect gets possessed by a demon. So they find our main character, who is a priest, who is also an exorcist, but is also an AI specialist. Kind of an interesting combination there, to go and investigate this android that says that they are possessed. And the Pope is kind of like, hey man, we need this to be a hacker, so you better find out that it's a hacker, right? So our exorcist AI specialist goes down and checks out the Artilect and discovers that maybe things are different than he thought, because either option means that the world is in trouble. Either this is a real possession, and that means that Artilects have souls, which means that they're sentient now, or there is a hacker, but if a hacker is able to get into how complex of a system that the AIs represent in this story, then that means that they could hack into the bioware in people's brains that are happening in the future. So either way we go, we have something absolutely death-defying. And so this story takes us on a huge adventure that is very multifaceted, that deals very heavily in science and religion, and it never really helps us come to a conclusion, which is something that I really liked about this novel. Gotta start off with the books that I didn't like. I've had a couple of disappointments lately. The first one is one of my first DNFs this year. It's called Severance by Ling Ma. This novel has a really interesting cover. Always kind of like caught my eye because it looks like, you know, a ripped notebook here. The back of the book, as well as the front, really mentions that it's won so many awards. All of these awards that I've never really heard of. It's definitely selling itself as a literary post-apocalyptic book where our main character, Candace Chen, is in New York and a big epic plague sweeps New York City, and then of course she has to deal with all of the aftermath of that. This book spends a huge amount of time describing every detail of this character's life. I mean, I get it, she's an introvert, and I get it, she doesn't like people, so it's exhausting for her to go to a party, for example. But then we spend every moment with her as she does every dish after the party, and she takes off every piece of clothing. It just got to be to the point where it was ad nauseum, every tiny detail about this character that I had no relatable connection to. I got to the point where I skipped a bunch of chapters to get to the exciting part of the book where we end up with a disease process that's sweeping New York City. And yet this character is trying to say that she's such a shut-in that she didn't notice. Like, the world stopped? She didn't notice that? Huh, that's not believable at all. I get that introverts are people who don't like social interaction, but if suddenly the subway stops working and you don't see anybody in New York City on your walk to a subway, you would think that would be like, huh, That's not right. The believability of this character was so poor for me, and the writing was just such a slog because I don't care about every little detail of this character, and yet we get almost no emotional interaction out of her. I really did not like this book. I ended up DNFing it. Definitely my first DNF of the year. I was really hoping that this was going to be one of the books that you haven't heard of that were actually secretly amazingly good. In case those of you out there are thinking that maybe literary science fiction is not for me, that's very, very plausible. So let's talk about some other questionable books that I had. They weren't DNFs, but they were not the best. You may be asking why I'm spending some time explaining these. Mostly because I understand that everybody doesn't always have my taste. I have a couple of booktubers whom I watch explicitly for the books they don't like, because I know those are the books that I'm gonna love. So I'm trying to give you guys a little bit of variety on this. Elysium by Jennifer Brissett. This is a short novel, and it is definitely one you can read in a day. It follows a character who is talking to an AI, I believe. At the back of the book, it says that a civilization has fallen, and there is a computer who is expected to kind of like tell you the story of what happened with the civilization that has fallen. But the problem is the computer is old and it's defragging, so the story doesn't 100% make sense, and you get little tiny snippets of the story throughout. And I thought this was such a cool idea. I haven't really read anything like it, and especially if you just like randomly flip through it, you can see like code breaks and stuff like that throughout the novel. I thought that that would be something that would be like really creative. I think that Miss Brissett just had a cool idea but had too many ideas, or maybe she just couldn't follow through with the execution very well. In the first 3 chapters, I think we are following 2 characters, and throughout the chapters they're randomly changing genders. So sometimes they're boyfriend-girlfriend, sometimes they're girlfriend-boyfriend, sometimes they're boyfriend-boyfriend, and then they're girlfriend-girlfriend, and then for a little while they're mother and son. I don't know, man. It was real messed up, and I thought that that could be really clever as part of the computer defragment. It changes, but then it doesn't really change because they are always having this very weird, very close kind of a relationship throughout time. But then we kind of just like drop them and go to a different part of the story, and then drop that story and go to a different part, and it was a little bit too fragmented for me. And the ending was not justification for going through all of the confusion of what this novel was. It was kind of a little bit of a mess, and I'm really sad to say that because I really think that this author is a really good author as far as like the crafting of the prose, and she took on a lot with this novel. I will probably watch her a little bit. I just think that this, for a debut novel, might have been a little bit too much. So if you are interested in a challenge though, you should definitely check that one out. I found it to be a little bit too disconcerting for myself. The next one is a book that I wanted to read. Came out last year, so you know I'm trying to find my Hugo nominations for this year. And this book is called The City Inside. And this novel is a future in India. This book follows one particular character who is a social media manager for a man who she dated in college, I think. It's kind of a weird relationship, but it's an interesting one because we get to see a whole lot about social media and how much effect that plays in the future, especially in India. She has to pander to the personality as well as be the person of the business sense behind all of the things that are happening. I thought this book really should have been more exciting for what it was. I really thought that the social media aspect was really interesting, but I thought that the interpersonal interplay between the main character and the person she's managing was just uncomfortable and weird. I really just wasn't into this story as much as I wanted to be. I don't know what it is about this novel that just really didn't catch me, but it wasn't for me. I didn't DNF it. I don't think I was the intended audience for this book. So that does it for my recent reads wrap up. I know that there was quite a lot of books in there, some that were good, some that were in the middle, and some that were DNFs. Let me know what you're reading in the comments down below. I'm always interested in adding more to my TBR, and until next time, you guys, see you later.